Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of October 15th, 2023. Today, I am pleased to offer you this discussion on the subject of applied innovation and how applied innovation has been advanced within the U.S. Transhumanist Party. We have our panel of U.S. Transhumanist Party officers joining us today, including our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia, our 2024 U.S. Vice Presidential Candidate and Director of Citizen and Community Science, Daniel Tweed, our Legislative Director, Jason Geringer, and our guest of honor for today is our very own Director of Applied Innovation, David Shumaker. David has been our Director of Applied Innovation for 3.75 years approximately since February of 2020, and he has been a member of the U.S. Transhumanist Party since 2017. I met him at RADFest in August of 2017, and he is a man of many talents. He is a technologist, futurist, explorer, transhumanist, cryonicist, and he uses creative thinking, collaboration, commitment, and behavior changes to close the gap between theory and practice. That is what applied innovation means to him. And unfortunately, by the end of the year, David will retire from his position as Director of Applied Innovation, but we wanted to take this opportunity to hear from him about his work, his experiences, the insights that he could share with us, as well as ideas that would be beneficial for the next person in the Director of Applied Innovation position, because David has done a great deal to build up this role within the USTP. And we also have joining us our friend and U.S. Transhumanist Party member, Alan Crowley. So welcome, Alan. And now, David, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gennady. First off, it's been a great pleasure to work with the United States Transhumanist Party over the years, and then the Arizona Transhumanist Party that was started previous election cycle. So Gennady did a good job, I think, of giving you an idea, a very cursory idea of my background, what those things I identify with, and also a little bit about how I approach this subject of applied innovation. What I want to do is take a few minutes and talk about how I came to it and what I've put into it with the help of many others, by the way. And then I want to use this as a springboard for those that might think that this might be a fit for them in the Transhumanist Party, and that they don't need to follow the same route that I came to this from. And I think you'll see as I talk about it why I think it's important perhaps to have a fresh look at this, why we're at a perfect time in the area of innovation, entrepreneurship, technical advancement, to maybe bring a little bit different background and a little bit different focus to this as we go forward. So that's what I want to try to do here over the next few minutes before we take questions and answers and perhaps discuss a few other things. My background, going into a little more detail than you'll see on the leadership page at the Transhumanist Party website. I grew up in a very culturally varied and diverse family lifestyle, which has me look at things differently. And I think looking at things differently is what gives you insight for innovations and how to apply them. At least that's my particular approach. In my very early years, as I was starting to have memories that I could hang on to for a lifetime, my family relocated from Portland, Oregon to Yokohama, Japan. Pretty big change for somebody that's 5 or 6 years old. There I was exposed to different religions, different cultural types, different norms for ages, roles for men and women, boys and girls, than I was currently getting in my mainstream American life back in Portland. For those that know Portland, Oregon, maybe Portland, Oregon was just a tad to the left or the right of mainstream ism in those days and continues to be today. But that's a story for another time. The point being is that trip to Japan where we lived for a few years and we traveled throughout the country. I've got scrapbooks that I still own to this day with mementos from shrines and silk factories and things that you just don't find here in the United States. And then what that meant when we moved back to the States after that was over. And I moved to a major city. I moved to San Francisco and lived in San Francisco then for a number of years. And then back to Oregon. And prior to that, I'd lived in Kansas. And prior to that, I'd lived in the wine country of California. So I got to see a lot of different things, which gives me a lot of different lenses to apply when looking at society as a whole. And as it turns out, I became attracted to technology also very young. A few years later, well, even before those few years later, I was attracted to things that fly. And I would spend evenings after dinner at the dining room table assembling plastic models of various types of aircraft, airplanes, things of that nature. And became really interested in the technology that went with that and how to make it go faster. And in those days, there was very much, at least in my perception, a spirit of adventurism and how high you could fly, how fast you could fly. And that took us to the space program of the 1960s, where I became an ardent observer of Mercury, Gemini, and then on to Apollo. And of course, we all know how that story ended after the many Apollo ventures to the moon. Unfortunately, I'm glad that we're going back now, but once again, that would be diverting from what I'm trying to say. The point is I became very much interested in that. When I lived in San Francisco, my parents knew that I had this interest in trying to reconnect with some of the societies overseas that I wasn't getting living back in the States, and they bought me a shortwave radio. And I started listening to shortwave radio, both voice. I found that a lot of countries had times where they would do their version of the news in English. So it became interesting, even at a really young age, to contrast what other countries were seeing newsworthy and what I was seeing as newsworthy on the 6 o'clock news. I learned a bit of Morse code because some of the, especially ship to shore and ship to ship communications were still Morse in those days. Somewhere along the line, that drug me into a ham radio hobby, where I then took Morris and used that to make connections all over the world, and then voice all over the world, and built antenna farms, and just had a wonderful time reconnecting with this huge society, not only in the United States, but outside the United States. So I think you see a trend that's forming there, which gave me a way to look at things. When it became time to get more advanced in my school years, I took a lot of science and math with physics and mathematics I saw as applied science. That's why I liked physics so much, and math supported that. And that led me to engineering, where I ran out of money for funding a college education. So back to those little plastic models on the dining room table, I looked around for where I could get advanced technical training and perhaps save some money to go to college. And I ended up joining the U.S. Air Force, where I had an intent to stay for 4 years to get that technical training, which I did, and then also to get the GI Bill, which allowed me to then go back to school. However, I was enjoying it so much, and I was enjoying the travel and the cultural experiences and so forth so much again that turned into nearly 25 years of service. And I was able to go from analog and digital electronics into computer systems and then the application for those, and got to be at a level where I could train and shape this for others, even getting to work on R&D projects when I was in the military, which I enjoyed immensely. Perhaps you can see why innovation and applying innovation became so important to me. After I retired, I still was at a nice young age and needed to take my military retirement, which wasn't enough to live on, and go to work in the civilian sector. And I ended up going to work for some Fortune 500 companies and did a little bit of work on my own and took that technical innovation, took the technical expertise that I had and used it to gain industry certifications, which is the way you move forward in those days in the computer sector. So I became a certified systems engineer, administrator, and even a certified trainer. And then along with other certifications as well. So what did I train people on? I trained them to get those same certifications. If they had the passion for the technology, this is how you got in and this is how you move forward. And it was very beneficial to see technology improve the lives of people and learning about technology to move the lives of people. So I bring that engineering mindset. It turned out to be computer engineering or computer applications or data center engineering, however you want to address that these days. Pardon me. And I was about ready to retire again. There's another theme for today. I was ready to retire again, this time from my civilian occupation, because I had amassed enough time with these companies that, along with my military retirement, I was in the fortunate situation of not being rich by any stretch of the imagination, but to have enough money that I could live comfortably and not have to worry about where the next dollar was coming from. About a little bit later than that, I met my current life partner, Susan Cutforth, who many of you know. She's active here, and she's also active in Humanity Plus and other organizations. And she's the one that introduced me to RadFest, where I ended up meeting Gennady and getting to hear Ray Kurzweil a number of times and get to hear Aubrey de Grey and then meet and get to know Aubrey de Grey a little bit. Those were my guiding lights early on with RadFest. Having met Gennady, I was very interested in what was going on with the Transhumanist Party, but was really putting my interest as far as longevity into another organization at that time. And as time went on, I felt time was better served here than there and made the switch and came across and started working and brought this idea of applied innovation along with it. So what I like is this methodical approach to longevity. It impacted my personal regime for longevity, along with genetic testing, laboratory research, personalized supplementation. And these are all examples of applied innovation. I was an early adopter of stem cell treatment for something that I had and advocated for that. So this is what I brought to applied innovation. I mentioned not only being the USTP director, but also ending up as the chair of one of the state organizations for here in Arizona. And we have that current chairman on our call with us today, Art Ramon Garcia. Thank you, Art, for taking over and doing such a wonderful job. I came to that because I got involved in the 2020 election cycle, and the then current chairman of the Arizona Transhumanist Party was one of the nominees, and I participated in that. And it got me further involved by going to things like the third party debate in Chicago and being introduced to another quite variety of speakers and viewpoints and so forth, something else that I really like. At the same time, that also got me back into the idea of public speaking. I had taught During my Air Force time, I spent one of my tours of duty teaching at one of their trade schools. And then after the Air Force in the evenings, I taught for a local community college. And then later I taught for some private institutions. So I was used to speaking in front of people, but this idea of speaking online was something new. So I'm sure a lot of you out there in the audience know Steele Archer, and I was very grateful to be able to participate with him and to do some blog podcasting with some other folks during that 2020 cycle. Anyway, I ascended to the chair of the Arizona Transhumanist Party, and when the Longevity Party of the U.S. was a separate party, I descended to the vice chair of that, which eventually rolled into the Transhumanist Party and into my director position here. So those are things that I brought to what was going on. But they're not the only things. The way I addressed it with that background was, at the time, technology was in a different place than it is now. I was finding in discussions online and in person with people that it was hard for many people to see new and emerging technologies as being something other than science fiction. I said I was an early adopter of stem cells, for example, and some people considered that nonsense, and they needed education on what was going on. So that's advocacy for pushing the envelope on innovation, applying the innovations that are there and making use of them, and making use of them for the best possible results for as many people as possible is the approach that I took. So social media postings, podcasts, participating in things like this over the years, that's all been part of that. As we go forward with a new director of applied innovation, I hope that they'll take a blank piece of paper, look at their background, and see what attracts them to innovation, entrepreneurship, and how it's applied in transhumanist circles. Take what they're really good at, what they have a passion about, and then look at the landscape that we find ourselves in now. If I was to stay, I would need to shift gears and go about this differently as well, because we are at what I believe to be the knee of the curve as far as exponential innovation. And that means that innovation, new technologies are happening so rapidly, it's hard for people to get their head wrapped around them before something new comes out and they feel overwhelmed. And when somebody's overwhelmed, at least me, that can cause you to be a little resistive to change. It's like, wait, slow down. I can't keep up with this. How do I go about that? Maybe we're past the time of advocating for these and maybe showing people how to integrate them into their lives. What are the things that they can do? Don't look all across the spectrum other than maybe to survey, but then pick the few things that can really impact their lives right now. And maybe we can do some projects or partnerships or things of that nature to show how applying innovation on a personalized basis is perhaps the way to go. I'm not decreeing that. These are some ideas. These are some of the challenges that are out there, because some things that I thought were going to be science fiction, I now am starting to see on a regular basis. I live in the Phoenix metro area, where Waymo has a driverless car rideshare cab company, however you want to do that. They have a certain area of town. They don't cover all of the Phoenix metro area, but you can summon one of their vehicles on your phone, get in and drive to the other place and get out and pay for it. And you never have to speak to anyone, and you can continue to work on whatever projects that you're working on as you go. That's now. Susan and I were south of town, not even in the Phoenix metro area, another little burb south of town. And we stopped at a family restaurant to get some dinner, where some of the tables were served by robotic waiters. So you'd have somebody come to the table, take your order, or you could scan the QR code and order that way, and then the robot would bring your food for you and attend to any of your other needs. These are things that are now, and this is only going to get faster as we go. And we'll probably talk some more about those things. There's other particular technologies that I find really significant right now, and I'd be really interested in what the audience and the other panelists have to say about those. So hopefully what I did was give you a little background of how and why I came to the Director of Applied Innovation, what I did with it while I had it, and why I see a need to not continue to do what David did, but to do what's new now and relevant as we move forward. So that's my desire. Thank you, Gennady.
Thank you very much, David, for that excellent overview. And it actually bridges quite nicely into the question that I wanted to ask you, and that is, in the course of your life, has the extent of technological progress been greater than, less than, or approximately on track with what you had expected, especially if you look back to your anticipations, say, in the 1960s or the 1970s, both before and after the first moon landing? How has the progress of technology turned out? And has it perhaps been different with regard to your expectations in different areas of technology?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it's going to be a mixed answer. There are some areas that I am elated to see that worked out at good or better than what I had in mind. And then there are some other areas that I'm deeply disappointed in. So let's talk about a couple of those. So for those that want to do the math, you can figure out how old I am, because I'm going to tell you that in the around 1960, I was about 10 years old. And I find 10 years old to be a very significant age in humans. And I think it helped me really shape my worldview. So the space program was very much a part of what was going on. I liked the idea of flying, but oddly enough, I didn't see myself in the cockpit of an airplane, and I didn't see myself in the capsule of a spacecraft. I saw myself as the engineer that made that happen and made it happen better. So the things that I looked at were like communication, for example. If you go back and do any research about what communication was like, air to ground, air to orbit, during the 1960s, it was very primitive to what we have today. And I saw ways to improve that, not only for the space program, not only for air forces and airliner companies, okay, but for everyone. I told you that I had an interest in shortwave radio about the same time. So putting those all together, it gave me the idea at 10 years old, sitting in San Francisco as a kid and saying, what if I could have a radio? And at that time, I was thinking of something to sit on the desk, like a ham radio size rig, something like that, where I could talk to people all over the world, but do it in a very reliable, high fidelity way. And of course, we all have our cell phones today. And just last night, I had a lengthy video conversation, Susan and I did, with some of her family members in New Zealand. And it's just a regular phone call. That's one of those that came out way better than I hoped. But going back to the space program, as we got into the 1970s and got, in my opinion, mired in other things, we gave up our dream of going to the stars. Not entirely. Some would be right to say that NASA pursued other avenues that were necessary. But I was one of those that really hoped that we would be putting astronaut boots on Mars in the 1980s. Clearly, that didn't happen. And it didn't happen at all in the 20th century. We did learn a lot with Space Lab, and we did learn a lot with the shuttle program. And certainly, it's been a qualified success, the International Space Station, in many, many ways, in my opinion. So once again, it's a mixed bag. Did it turn out better? Did it turn out worse? Aerospace engineering has gone along nicely with a few setbacks. People probably remember the Concorde, the first supersonic passenger liner. Well, it's now 2023, and perhaps we have a better solution for supersonic travel than we did in the past. And perhaps hypersonic space planes and other such things are not too far away, but then I'm a bit of an optimist. So I guess the most direct answer to your question is some of this, some of that.
Yes, thank you very much, David. And indeed, it is a nuanced answer in terms of the progress of communication technologies. We have certainly made great strides, but in terms of transportation, infrastructure, or space travel, we are definitely behind where a lot of, for instance, the great science fiction authors from the golden age of science fiction thought that we would be by now. And we have some audience feedback on this matter as well. Jason Geringer writes he did not expect us to have cell phones that are like little computers, but we still did not get our jetpacks. And he thought we might have flying cars by now. And we kind of do with various experimental prototypes, but of course, they still do not have mass adoption. Mike Lazine writes that we have different options with flying cars, but nothing like Back to the Future 2. And we also don't have anything that is mass produced with regard to flying cars as of yet. So, echoing the statement that I had made, we have a number of fascinating questions here. So, Alan Crowley wonders, what do you remember about 1969? And one of those options is the moon landing, which, of course, people in my generation and subsequent generations also are very well aware of. I'm not as aware of Manson, so I suppose that shows my kind of hindsight bias. But David, what do you remember about 1969?
Well, I don't think that would surprise anybody what my answer would be. And of course, that's going to be the moon landing as well. And it was quite an accomplishment. And I like the idea that I've gone back and looked at some of the videos that circulated at the time, TV press coverage from around the world. And sure, it was a race between the United States and then the Soviet Union to first put somebody on the moon, kind of a military pride thing or nationalist pride thing. But what encouraged me is I look back and you see headlines from newspapers, yes, they had newspapers back then, that said, we did it. It was a very world inclusive type of an adoption, whatever the original intent was. And I took that with great pride. There were many other things that were going on. I mean, I can think back to the election, the political struggles that were going on in those days, but I just prefer not to focus on them. I'm not blind to them, but that's not where I want to put the energy. The reason I call myself an optimist isn't because I can't see the bad. It's because I focus on the good and want to make it better. So that's my idea. By the way, one quick comment on the previous topic. As you mentioned about people talking about where's my flying car. I think there was even a book to that name. I think people saw the flying car back in the 60s kind of like the Jetsons. They saw it as everything was the same as far as transportation was concerned. It was a single family device for transportation with a little bit of a status symbol that took you from point A to point B and then on vacation trips. But reading Kurzweil over the years, he's taught me that new technologies need a convergence of things to really take off, pun intended, okay? So I think with flying cars, I think the convergences are something like rideshare, something like artificial intelligence and autonomous vehicles. Because for any of us that have flown, I've never had a pilot's license, but I did a lot of right seat flying in Cessna 172s and even a 182 on occasion. There's a lot to flying. So to have that same number of people able to fly as drive doesn't seem reasonable to me. It seems much more that we automate the process and that we have places where maintenance, which is a very big deal on flying craft, is taken care of in a systematic way. So maybe something like a ride share or taxi, or maybe there's even another way to do this that I haven't thought of, but it's going to take a convergence of things. And by the way, I'm starting to see those converge, so maybe we'll get those flying cars pretty soon. Electric vehicles will probably help as well, because now you don't have gasoline flying over the top of your head or jet fuel. You know, you've got batteries and other such things. So some rambling thoughts on that as well.
Yes, indeed. I do hope we see the convergence of technologies necessary to make flying cars happen. And of course, the book, Where is My Flying Car, was authored by J. Storrs Hall, who is a member of our extended community, whom I would like to have as a virtual Enlightenment Salon guest at some point in time where we can discuss this in greater detail. But I see a lot of similarities between the, let's say, abortive progress of flying car technology and the abortive progress of humankind's journey into space, in that there was a lot of promise for both in the middle of the 20th century as well as the third quarter of the 20th century. And then, for whatever reason, humankind, our general culture, turned inward, in my view, and some technologies were still developed, like computing and communication, but there was less of a focus on the external, on colonizing other worlds or expanding the reach of our species or really building out our material infrastructure. And I hope that can change. And I hope that transhumanism can inspire that to change, so that we could indeed be said to be on the verge of much greater advances. And now I would like to pose another question that was raised by one of our viewers, Joseph Moore, who wonders, what are your thoughts on AI and machine learning? Are most people overstating AI's potential problems?
Yeah, so one of the things that is a rapidly expanding field right now, of course, is AI. And what's getting the biggest press attention and commercial attention, I think, are large language models at the moment. We know that they're not perfect. I think that's been discussed on this forum and others. So I think the question goes to typically what happens to new technologies, and it goes through this hype cycle, if you will, where there's big promise, and especially when it becomes commercial, there are even bigger promises that are made. Some of those are fulfilled, some of those aren't, but reaction to public reaction to what's offered then leads us in the way of products that might actually become useful over time. And they might be gradiated. The cell phone is probably a really good example. I've got a high-end Samsung cell phone that allows me to do photographic detailed pictures of the moon, for example, standing in my backyard. That's something that my digital SLR doesn't even do adequately, unless I was to go spend a considerable more amount of money on antenna or on lenses than I currently have. So is it overhyped? Yes. And when it's overhyped, then going to the question, I think it leads itself to having dangers overhyped too, because we offer a great amount on one end, people could see perhaps they can read into that a great amount of dangers on the other end. My answer is going to be a balanced answer once again. That's probably what you're going to get most out of me. Maybe that's because of the cultural diversity that I found. Maybe it's because at the dinner table as a kid growing up, one parent was a staunch Democrat and the other one was a staunch Republican, and we always had these discussions back and forth. But I've learned to see on both sides of this. So yes, I'll answer clearly that there can certainly be dangers to what's going on with AI. The fact that we're talking about them and that they're in a public forum, I think gives me encouragement that we can try to deal with them. David Wood, who many of you know, has sponsored many things in London Futurists on this discussion. And I would invite you to go and look at what he has in his YouTube archives and some of what he's read about. I think he could probably answer that far more than me. But we need to keep our eye on the ball. We need to do that with any technology, not just artificial intelligence. I myself see great promise, but with great promise, there's always great danger. I'm an advocate for the current generation of nuclear power. And the reason that we have a current generation of nuclear power has to do with mishaps, but also continual engineering from what we've done in the past. And I would apply that similar kind of model to the dangers associated with artificial intelligence.
Yes, thank you very much, David. And one aspect of your presence and activity here in the U.S. Transhumanist Party that I have always appreciated is your nuanced approach to issues, an approach that transcends conventional binaries of left versus right or simplistic attempts to characterize a particular topic, for example. And I wonder if you think that the USTP has achieved that position as a more nuanced set of voices on the issues that really matter to humanity at large, that we have been able in the preceding years since 2018, when you have been involved with us, to present commentary and solutions that most people perhaps overlook because they are too stuck in these binaries or these simplistic outlooks on these topics.
Yeah, that's a subject that I really like, and it's one of the things that brought me to the USTP. Not the only thing. The core values for the USTP fit nicely, and but the fact that it was a big tent party. So one of the things that I had observed going back to those dinner table discussions between one parent solidly blue and one parent solidly red was the fact that people can get stuck in an opinion. Now, to my parents' credit, they loved each other and they had that dynamic going on, so they could work many times to a common understanding. And sometimes they just agreed to disagree. So there's two things going on there when it comes to the USTP that I could apply. One is the nuance that Gennady, you spoke of, because once you get past the talking points on the left and the right, then if you can still continue to talk, then you can talk into those nuanced areas and perhaps reach some compromises or at least be able to see each other's opinion. And I definitely see that going on inside the Transhumanist Party because it purports to be and is a big tent organization. So my political persuasions don't have to be totally in line with any of the other officers or members, and everyone else can feel the same way. What we do have an obligation to do, I think, though, is to speak and listen and the listen part is the hardest part. But I think we do that well. I like the fact that over the years, the large variety of guests that I've seen here on the Enlightenment salons. We've had people that are all over the political map and even the sociological map, if you will. And that's all good conversation here. We do have party platform, and that is ranked choice voted on by the membership. And there's good discussion that goes along with that as well. So very pleased with that. Very disappointed in some other organizations where you may have to pass a litmus test before you can be considered a bona fide member of their particular organizations. For the purposes of voting and being able to vote in closed state primary elections, I have swapped my reported party affiliation between the major parties numerous times so that I could vote for whoever I thought was maybe the most deserving, which means I get all the campaign information from all spectrums of the compass. And the way that they promote wedge issues is very much the same, even though their wedge issue may be different. And I'm very, very glad that we do not participate at all in that in the U.S. Transhumanist Party.
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you for that excellent feedback, David. And I completely agree with you. The range of discourse we have promoted here at the Virtual Enlightenment Salons, as well as our resolute abstinence from partisan talking points on the wedge issues, have set us apart quite considerably. And we have joining us Dr. Jose Cordero, our technology advisor and foreign ambassador from Spain. His connection is a bit patchy, but he does have a question for you, David. You have heard Ray Kurzweil several times. What do you think about his two so-called magic dates of 2029 or 30 for longevity escape velocity and 2045 for the singularity and immortality through biological rejuvenation? It would be great to see how much you agree or disagree. And Jose says, get ready for his new book, The Singularity is Nearer, in the summer of 2024.
Yeah, thank you, Jose. By the way, I've signed up for an advance copy of that book, and I'm eagerly awaiting it. I certainly enjoyed his previous books quite well. As far as to the core of your questions for the longevity escape velocity date in 2045, I certainly would not be one to bet against Ray Kurzweil, whatever I thought, okay? His track record is much better than mine. But perhaps I do bet on that a little bit. I've already given some indications to what my age is. So if you extrapolate out to 2030 and to 2045, you can see that I am very hopeful that he is correct about those dates for me personally and for other members of my family, but also for humanity at large. And I'm talking about the longevity aspects, of course. Now, I am very interested in longevity. It's number one on my list, but there are other things on that list too that I think that the advent of technological singularity and LEV would greatly enhance for all of society. I'm hoping for a paradigm shift in the way that we look at humanity. If we ever get to the point, and we will, that we have indefinite life extension, I see that perhaps as the tipping point for how we value human life. It's morbid to think about, perhaps, but those who maybe would engage in extreme actions to get their way, hopefully them, or there would be enough others of them around them to reshape the conversation from ending the life of somebody who's going to die anyway to it being quite a different proposition to ending the life of someone who doesn't have to die, or at least not for hundreds or thousands or whoever knows what that number might be in years. So back to your question, Jose. I don't bet against Ray. I bet with him in a lot of different ways. I'm all in, and I want to see it for many different reasons.
Excellent answer. Thank you very much, David. And I really appreciate what you said about radical life extension leading everybody to recognize the immense value of individuals' lives. I think one of the mindsets that really fuels conflict today, and especially war and terrorism, as we are unfortunately seeing in the Middle East, is the idea that individual lives are expendable, that they can be used essentially as means to satisfy particular political or ideological objectives. And especially in parts of the world where the quality of life is generally quite poor and people have low life expectancies, some people think that individual lives can just be thrown away, essentially, or used up in the achievement of geopolitical or religious objectives, especially. But I think that will be a much more difficult proposition for people to believe in if individual lives are potentially indefinite in duration. So I really thank you for that insight. And on the subject of longevity, our friend Ampero observes that in Star Trek, which takes place in the 23rd and 24th centuries, they still had not cured aging, and that was a limitation to the vision of Gene Roddenberry and subsequent creators within the Star Trek franchise. John H. also wrote that right now computer interfaces have advanced to a greater extent than many of us had expected. And if you check out the so-called 23rd century Star Trek Enterprise interface, he characterizes it as kludgy. And that was an example of what was considered to be high tech in the 1960s and 70s. So thank you for that observation, John. But I'm curious, David, when you were thinking about technological progress in the 1960s and 1970s, how far did you expect progress against aging would have taken us by this time in our history? And were you disappointed, or is this approximately what you expected in terms of the state of our medical advancement?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because for whatever reason, that wasn't something that was on my radar back then. Maybe I was still immortal at 10 years old. Maybe that's what was going on. But so I hadn't given that some thought. What I do want to comment, though, about was Star Trek, which is probably one of my favorite franchises that are out there because while there's a fantasy element to it, there's much more of a scientific element to it. But all science fiction needs to be relatable to the current population. I think Alan may have something more to say about this, but from my layman's viewpoint, when you're going to tell a science fiction story, it needs to be relatable to the people that are going to read it or view it. So when I watched Star Trek in the late 1960s, it seemed very futuristic to me. When I go back and look at the original series today, it looks very archaic and kludgy, as they say. But it did have some innovative ideas. Taking it back to the topic on longevity, I think longevity has escaped the sci-fi realm because unless you're doing animation, your actors are going to age. So Star Trek's 5-year mission, you would definitely see a difference in aging of the characters from season 1 to season 5. And if it was Star Trek didn't go that long, but had it gone to season 5, you would have seen that. And had it gone to season 10, you definitely would have seen that. So you have to have that explainable in the story. And I think Star Trek's probably done a good idea of relating it to the masses, as they've had characters from earlier versions of Star Trek show up in later versions of Star Trek and explain about long Vulcan life, or even, improved, medical capabilities for longevity, but they haven't approached indefinite life extension. And I think it's because it's not part of the story that they can tell at this point. Back to me at age 10 and being immortal at age 10, I didn't think too much about that. It wasn't long after I started getting into this, though, that my father's mother died, and I saw the impact that that had on him. And I think that's probably the first time that I felt mortal. Not because I was going to die anytime soon. 10-year-olds still think of themselves as immortal, but because somebody I knew that had value in our family had died, and I saw the effect that it had on the other people that were around them. But for whatever reason, the light didn't go on. I was more interested in maintaining good medical coverage. We had that because of my father being in the Army, and then later on I had that with mine being in the Air Force, and now I have retirement coverage that provides me that really well. But I've had to nuance it as I've got involved in the longevity community, getting treatments and so forth for things that I wanted. So was there a disappointment? I don't think so, only because I didn't set good expectations at that time. I know that you saw that differently in your youth, Gennady.
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you for that discussion. And Ampero follows up with the observation that it has been said that science fiction is the literature of the present, not the future. And what you stated about the limitations on the actual human actors within Star Trek and their own biological aging would have limited the premises of that universe to what was realistically able to be expressed on the screen. Though what is interesting is in Star Trek The Next Generation, it is posited that some of the original crew of the Enterprise do live into their early 100s, like their 130s or 140s, because they could start with a new cast and just have a setting that is sufficiently later in the future that the older cast members, who are now noticeably older, can be said to be in their 130s or 140s, and they look like they're in their 60s or 70s. And it's plausible to posit some sort of slowdown in aging, but not a reversal of biological aging. And Alan writes that the story is the key in science fiction. The setting helps tell the story. And Roddenberry pitched the show as Wagon Train to the Stars. So, Alan, perhaps you might like to expand upon that observation as it relates to science fiction in particular. I think we have an issue with Alan's microphone, and the sound, unfortunately, is not translating. But Alan, if you could write your comments in the chat, we will relay them to our viewers. Now, Daniel writes in our internal chat, science fiction's failure to predict or imagine the advent of the personal computer exemplifies an interesting lack in predictive imagination. Computers were always portrayed as giant centralized units in a downtown building. So that speaks more to the idea that science fiction is a reflection of the present rather than the future. And there's a comment by Jason as well to that effect. He thinks a lot of the fear of AI comes down to the unknown, because when AI reaches superintelligence, we have no idea what that's going to look like. We have no idea from our present vantage point. So a lot of dystopian science fiction right now encapsulates that fear, but it doesn't really present what would likely actually happen in the future of AI. And our friend Edward Hudgens wonders what is the best transhuman science fiction creation. He would argue that 2001 A Space Odyssey is the first transhumanist film. Now, it's interesting. That movie was made in the 1960s when you were in your teenage years still, David. So how did that strike you when it first came out? Do you remember seeing it? Do you remember your impressions of it, and how they might have conditioned your expectations regarding the future?
Thank you, Edward. I'm not sure that I disagree with you on that. I'm not sure I really know what the first transhumanist uh, sci-fi movie might be, but you may be right on that. I definitely do remember it being an event to go see that. It was not like there's only been a handful of movies that I would say fall into that category, and 2001: A Space Odyssey was definitely one. Now, I read the book before I went and saw the movie, and I was trying to visualize things from the printed page. But when I went and saw the movie itself, I think this is the value of sci-fi movies. The way technology was represented in the movie, I'm thinking especially when the lead actor goes up to the space station as a waypoint before they go to the moon. And you see familiar names. You see, I don't remember now just off the cuff what those names were, but you see hotel names and you see airline names and you see things that are very, very specific, not generalized like we tend to see. To me, that made it very, very real. When I had not ever taken an airplane flight up to that point, it was just a couple of years later was my first time actually in an airplane. But I used to go out to the airport and just watch planes take off and land, both civil and military, because we had an Air National Guard station that was at the airport. So F-4s were flying in and out of there. And I very much liked that. That was very real to me. And I felt that same sense of realism when I was looking at the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey. The fact that it was very hyped at the time, a lot of publicity is what I mean when I say it. It was, a very strong, high expectations. Sometimes those movies are hard for me because the expectation bar is set so high that when I go to the movie, it's okay, or maybe less than okay. 2001: Space Odyssey exceeded that expectation that I had. So there was a feelings that went with it, as well as the objective looking at the technology, the way that it was presented, and then the whole premise of the story. Why did humans excel to the point to go to the stars where other species on this planet didn't? And what does that mean for the long-term future? Those are all transhumanist thoughts. I think you may be right, Edward.
Yes, thank you very much, David, for that response. And Edward also points out that Arthur C. Clarke's The City and the Stars was the first real modern transhumanist novel. He also recommends Olaf Stapledon. Daniel Tweed says that 2001: A Space Odyssey is still his favorite film. John H. points out that it was released in 1968. Art Ramon mentions Metropolis from the 1920s as a proto-transhumanist film. John H. even says one could think of Dracula and Frankenstein as having transhumanist themes, as both involve defiance of death. Of course, in a more typical bioconservative fashion, understandable given that those novels were written in the 19th century. These were intended as cautionary tales, and I think they still color a lot of people's thinking about technological progress and some boundaries that, in their view, should not be crossed. Alan writes, with regard to his observations, the most viewed show at the time when Star Trek was inaugurated was Gunsmoke, which also told stories relating to the time at the present set in a Western. So sci-fi was considered fringe at the time. Westerns were mainstream. So Roddenberry framed it to the network as a Western and an adventure, but to a much farther destination, physically and in terms of the imagination. So thank you for that perspective. It's interesting to consider a time when science fiction would have been a fringe genre. Now it is a much more mainstream kind of genre that a lot of people appreciate, even people who are skeptical about the possibilities of realizing those technologies anytime soon might still enjoy the premises and the thoughts that they provoke. So now we have Mike Lazine, who also makes an interesting
Oh, yeah.
observation about the Dune movies. He thinks that universe has some transhumanist themes, but it also had some dystopian themes indicative of a typical Hollywood need of good and evil, the need for a conflict. And of course, Dune is an interesting universe in that it takes place actually in the early 11th millennium in a society that has actually rejected AI, but has slowly, painstakingly, over the millennia, achieved interstellar space travel and has various other interesting technologies. But it speaks to a universe that doesn't have a significant technological component that already exists in our world. But the Dune series was influential for me when I was a child because it was already quite prominent both in terms of books and in terms of movies, as well as computer games that were made on the basis of the Dune universe in the 1990s. But what you speak of with regard to the contrast between how we perceived aging and death when we were children, David, is very much accurate because, as you know, I recoiled against mortality when I first learned of it, and I definitely did not think of myself as invulnerable. Initially, the adult figures in my life tried to console me by saying, well, people live to be 100 years old. And I interpreted that very literally to think that, for instance, when I was 4, I had 96 years left to live, and I could at least take comfort in that remaining time. What I didn't realize then was that I was just given an approximation, and an optimistic approximation essentially meant to console me. In fact, lifespans were typically a lot shorter and far more variable. And what really distressed me was to find out that children could also die. And I learned about that because I learned about World War II not that much later, actually. It was, I would say, around Victory Day 1992. So I wasn't quite 5 years old yet. It was May 9th, 1992. And the television at the time, there were 3 television channels in Belarus. They were all showing old Soviet World War II films, including about the atrocities that the Nazis had committed when they invaded the Soviet Union. And it was shown how the Nazis were hanging people. It was also shown that children valiantly resisted the Nazis and they became heroes of the Soviet Union, but they were killed in the process of their resistance. So I learned that, yes, children too could die. And those were some formative experiences of my life. I write about them in my book, Death is Wrong. And this problem of mortality and the imperative need to overcome it. So Edward Hudgens writes in regard to Frankenstein, opponents of GMO foods call them the Franken food. They don't understand the science. So this is one way in which Mary Shelley perhaps did not intend this, but the influence of Frankenstein on the general culture has generally been one in the direction of techno skepticism. So we have a large number of questions from our chat. I would like to pose one from Daniel Tweed, who wonders, were you as disappointed as he was with America's failure to go metric? Would we be an inherently more innovative society if we had gone metric? And this was before my time in the 1970s, where there was an attempted transition. Of course, I was born in a country which did use the metric system. And to me, the metric system is far more intuitive because everything is in multiples of 10 rather than 12 or 5,280. But David, what were your recollections of that period in American history? And why do you think the transition fell through ultimately?
Yeah, so actually, I was thinking about this the other day. I read an article on why we should abandon the metric system, but that we shouldn't go back to the normal imperial systems. We should look at base 9 instead of base 10. The only reason that we've done base 9, or the only reason that we did base 10 is because of these, right? But humans, the way our brains work, we tend to interpret a lot of things in variations of the number 3. For example, on the clock, we have base 12, which is divisible by 3. We have 60 seconds, also divisible by 3. And the author went through a lot of different reasons. Now he says, no, why base 9? Well, that's 3 threes. It gives you a large enough set of digits, numerals to work with, almost as many as base 10 would. But it allows you to divide things into threes much easier because in metric, anytime you divide by 3, you end up with infinite fractions. So he made a good case. That's what got me thinking about this. But to your question, back in the 1970s when that happened, I was a young adult. Probably considered myself to be a typical American, and maybe at the time, let me stress, at the time, a little wrapped up in American exceptionalism. So why does the American country, this is what I think was sold and defeated the idea of the metric system, is why should we change? We have the strongest economy on the planet. We have our own ways of doing things. Just because a large number of other people do it different doesn't mean that we should change to that if this is what's working for us. And I think I bought into that at the time. At the same notion, though, I was already heavily into technology at the time, which uses the metric system. So I was using both side by side. And in my way of thinking, I was using metric where it made the most sense. And I was using the imperial system where it had culturally demonstrated an ability to be able to continue. But I think the average American, if there is such a thing, probably bought it more into the idea of why should we change? What we're doing is just fine. And the cost of changing, both monetary cost and then cost to civilization, would have been great. So I don't know. Maybe I'll answer the question by saying I'm persuaded that base 9 might not be a bad idea.
Thank you for that answer. And hopefully, with the technologies that we have, where it's so much easier to make conversions now, you could even type into Google what is X meters in feet or X ounces in grams, for example, it is easier to go back and forth between the two systems of measurement, as well as two other systems of measurement as well. Now, those of us who have studied chemistry, physics, engineering have extensively used the metric system because it has become standard in those disciplines in many respects. So right now, the United States exists with a kind of mixed system where for the more precise scientific applications, the metric system is used, and it's particularly useful when international scientific collaborations are undertaken. But in the day-to-day lives of most Americans, the standard English system is still utilized most often, and it's difficult to avoid it as well. So when I track my runs, for example, I track them in miles, even though the applications I use give me the option to track them in kilometers. And I most likely do that because it's easier for me to discuss the results with other American runners who track their runs in miles. Now, Mike Lazine wonders, did you do anything for DARPA if it was around when you were in the armed forces? Or do you recall any familiarity with DARPA or its projects or your thinking about them at the time?
Well, if I did, I probably couldn't tell you, but I didn't. I did do some R&D projects, though, and they were Air Force Army based. My last assignment in the Army was coordinating communication systems for close air support between the Army and the Air Force. And you would think that they would tap the same contractors, they would have the same standards, but of course that's not the case. So that's a lot of what I was doing. I worked with an Air Force organization called AFOTEC, which you can look up, see if I can remember what the acronym stands for, Air Force Research and Testing or something along that line. They're out of Albuquerque, New Mexico, if you're interested in trying to find out more about them. They work with Sandia Labs, which is a lot of nuclear research. I spent some time working at a couple of the nuclear research sites, but nothing to do with nuclear. We were just tapping some of the other engineers and associated skills that were there for some of the things that we needed to do. It was actually a very enjoyable time because even though I had an engineering background, I wasn't an engineer in their eyes. I was a subject matter expert. So I got to have the enviable position of being able to try out the things that they did and suggest improvements and evaluate how those improvements worked in both a strategic and tactical environment that we were in today. We had a different set of threats that confronted us at the time that I was doing this than what went on now, but it was fascinating. Now, maybe not said in your question, but maybe implied, would I have liked to have done some things with DARPA? The answer would have been an unqualified yes, just because of the things that they were into were, at least in my imagination, very much more interesting than the interesting things that I was doing. I don't mean to say that what I was doing wasn't interesting, but the rumor mill puts out some pretty fantastic things, and I'd love to have seen if I could have influenced some of those, hopefully for the better.
Yes, thank you for that answer, David. And certainly the projects you were involved with do sound quite fascinating. Luis Arroyo also wonders if you remember Luna 2, which was the first object to touch the surface of the moon. It was a Soviet lunar probe that was sent in 1959. So you would have been around 10 years old at the time. And Luis thinks it must have been weird to see anything land on the moon robot or human. This was 2 years after Sputnik, which set off the space race. But it's interesting, too, that the Soviet Union also had the first object to contact the surface of the moon. Do you think this actually motivated the United States to accelerate its moon program? And how did Americans feel about it at the time?
So I think the whole environment pushed America to do that. In the late 50s, I think American exceptionalism, at least by my definition, was standard. At least it seemed to be where I grew up. Mine was tempered a little bit because of the exposure and even immersion at times into other cultures that I was able to do as a young child, but still I wasn't immune from it. So I very, very much remember Sputnik. Sputnik was a huge shock. And it was, I think, portrayed to the American people as a huge shock. Luna 2, I don't remember as well, but I think that had to be part of the equation. I don't think there is just one single reason, and I don't think you're implying that, but I don't think there was one single reason that America got so wrapped up in this. It was more like there was a momentum moving in a direction that America had not moved in and needed to move in and needed to move quick. So John Kennedy made his famous speech about putting a person on the moon by the end of the decade. So he set the parameters, he set the expectation almost, now that I think about it, saying Luna 2 doesn't count. I hadn't really thought of that before. But he set the expectation and put it in personal terms of saying that a human will step foot on the moon. So maybe there was some geopolitics at play there as well. These things are very deep and very wide as far as why things get done the way they do, and the way he was able to mobilize Congress to move forward in this quest to put the first human on the moon, I think just shows how much the country was wrapped up in this. I was living in Japan in the late 50s. And there was and I don't remember the exact date for Sputnik, but it's during this time. And the early seeds of humans reaching out beyond the Earth occurred during this time. And we had an eclipse. It was an annular eclipse, much like the one that occurred yesterday here in the Phoenix area and across certain parts of the West. Maybe Gennady, I don't know whether you were in the shadow of that or not, but we were in the 80% area of this. So I actually went and made a pinhole camera, much like I had done back in the 1950s, so I could see for myself the transition of the moon across the sun, and it brought that whole experience back. So the idea of the eclipse, the idea of Sputnik, the idea of Luna, all contributed to this look up instead of looking down at the Earth. And I think that set the stage for the space race of the 1960s.
Yes, indeed. And it is actually fortunate to some extent that this kind of competitive impetus existed, because perhaps the United States would not have landed a man on the moon otherwise. And it was interesting, too, this is less well known to the general public, but Carl Carlisle informed us of this during our virtual Enlightenment Salon with him in February of this year, that in October 1962, Hubert Humphrey, then a member of Congress, tried to use a similar kind of impetus to urge for the scientific conquest of death, because in his visit to the Soviet Union, he saw some preliminary research into that endeavor. And imagine today what a major victory it would be for the longevity movement if a politician of the caliber of Hubert Humphrey were to use those specific words, the scientific conquest of death, in urging for essentially a moonshot type of program for longevity. Now, Alan has a question. He wonders, do you consider innovation, invention, and creativity to be synonymous? If not, what is the difference?
Yeah, no, I don't actually. Um, at least in my lexicon, I do see them differently. So let me see if I can try to explain my lexicon to you. Um, Let me start this way. Let me start with invention. Normally, I would like to go right to left in your order, but I'll start in the middle this time for what I see on the screen. So, invention is, for me, producing something new. It may or may not have an application, this idea of new. On another venue, we've talked a bit about Tesla and Edison and some of the things that they've done. And many people consider Edison the winner of that. Perhaps there's a parallel here, and maybe other panelists can think of a better parallel, but this is the one that I'll try for the moment. So you invent something that's new, novel, and creative, but you don't have a market for it, or you don't have a means to address the market for it. Then there's no energy associated to push that forward. I don't know what the numbers are, but the US Patent Office has thousands, maybe tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of patents. How many of those are in use? I don't know, but it's clearly not all of them, and I suspect it might even be a low number. But those were all inventions. So an innovation then can be taking an invention and perhaps mixing it with other ideas to be able to make this suitable for adaptation. It can be taking two established ideas and mixing them together and finding a new way to do that. You hear of innovative uses for things. For example, I would say that using drugs, what's the term called when you use it for something other than what the FDA originally approved it for? Your doctor can prescribe it for something that's a tertiary type of situation. That's innovative. It's using something for other than what it was intentionally designed for, but can be used. It's not an invention. It takes creativity to be able to take the invention and make it an innovation. Or it takes creativity to be able to take two ideas and put them together and make it something that might be suitable. But I'll go one step further and throw another term in there, and that's entrepreneurship. It takes an entrepreneur to take a look at this and go, how do I sell this to the public to make a profit? And keep in mind that companies need to make profits to be able to continue. So I'm not looking profit here as a good word or a bad word. It's just something that has to happen for this to maintain that energy to continue, which an invention doesn't necessarily have. So they're all related to each other. It's just how far along that you want to use them. An invention may be brilliant, but never marketed because there was never an innovative use for it, and there was not an entrepreneur that came along and was able to take it to market and continue to grow from that. I hope that helps with how I see this.
Yes, it seems that Alan is pleased with your answer, as am I. Thank you for outlining those distinctions. And now we have a large amount of audience feedback that I would like to share. So Jason writes, in regard to AI, we've made all kinds of machines throughout our history, but we've never made one that is going to be smarter than us. And of course, there have been various arguments about what that would entail. Some people posit that there's danger behind that. Others would say greater intelligence at least tends to correlate with greater morality, and this could lead to solutions to problems that the unaided human mind would not be able to solve. And perhaps in your nuanced perspective, David, you would see some truth or reason to take seriously both sides of that particular argument. Mike Lazine writes that he agrees with you with regard to the use of nuclear power. It has become far safer than the Chernobyl power plant, for instance, and what happened there was human malfeasance. Essentially, they deliberately turned off the safety systems that existed even there in order to run a test. Daniel Tweed writes that the pictures of the whole Earth in vast space, the overview effect, would have been some of the most valuable returns of the space program. And he wonders what the biological equivalent of the overview effect might be. He also says we need Dune's planetary ecologists now more than ever. But I do wonder what your thoughts are on this question, David. What would be the biological equivalent of the overview effect, particularly with regard to longevity? What illustration, event, breakthrough could convince millions of people, billions of people, that radical life extension is achievable and it's desirable? What could shift people's perspectives to foster that recognition?
I've had this discussion with a number of people, and I've become persuaded that it won't be something like a snapshot. I remember the pale blue dot snapshot, perhaps that's what we're referring to. And that was like a moment in time. The world was different after the pale blue dot snapshot. With longevity, I see it, I don't know, I'm searching for words, maybe more personal than that. For example, there is a lot that hangs on the fact, biblical from a Christian standpoint, Judeo-Christian standpoint, and others, of 120 years is given to man. I think when people start, a significant number of people start living past that 120-year mark, it will have that wake-up effect. It's like once again, I'm struggling for words. I wanted to say the silly arguments, but that sounded, I don't know, not the way that I wanted to describe this. The arguments or the discussions that I've had over such things as telomere, the Hayflick number, many, many different things that are pointed to as the reason that humans can't live beyond 120, suddenly are not topics of discussion anymore. At that point, I think the conversation will change from can humans routinely live past 120 to perhaps do you want to live past 120? Or what does this mean? What is our moral responsibility to those that are less than 120 to get them to be able to move on past 120 with the rest of us? And I say the rest of us because I want to be one of those, okay? So I guess we're back to Jose's 2029, 2030, 2045 numbers. And those are not the pale blue dot either, but they hold the promise of the pale blue dot. When we can routinely say it's not just blue zones, but everywhere that whatever the technology methodologies that we're using that allow us to live to that point, and that we're still safe, sane, productive, individuals living on and contributing to society, it will have a massive effect on acceptance at large.
Yes, thank you for those thoughts, David. And I agree that breaching the boundaries of today's maximum lifespans would be important to trigger that realization in the general public. So the world record for longevity is still held by Jean Calment, who died at the age of 122 years. There has been no other documented human to have lived past age 120. That doesn't mean that they haven't existed, because when I've spoken with experts who validate supercentenarians, they believe that perhaps only about 40% or so of truly existing genuine supercentenarians today have been validated. Some of the supercentenarians or their families do not give the researchers enough access to truly enable the age of that person to be confirmed. But nonetheless, people are fairly confident that Jean Calment is the oldest documented human being. And if that boundary is no longer seen to be insurmountable, I think that will change a lot of people's perceptions of what is possible. Daniel Tweed also writes that if whole body MRI imaging were to become super low cost and ubiquitously available, maybe that would also be a bio overview effect. There are already companies that could perform whole body MRI scans for a few $1,000s. So this is coming, and I think in the next decade, the whole body MRIs will become less expensive, particularly if they are seen as elective. So if businesses decide to offer them as an option outside of the conventional medical system, perhaps they would not have insurance reimbursements associated with them. But as a result of that, there would be less third-party bureaucracy associated with that. And like, say, with LASIK surgery or plastic surgery, people would actually have more choices and an easier time getting these scans, but they would, of course, pay out of pocket, hopefully a few $100s, not a few $1,000s at that point. So now I would like to ask Art Ramon if he has any questions for you, David.
Yeah, but let me get some things out of my head that have been floating around. I heard that the meter wasn't invented by the French, but that it was the Egyptians who, it was the measurement of a drop of water on a hydrophobic surface. I don't know. I read it, or I saw it in a documentary. It was an interesting theory. Another thing about innovation, things say like, nuclear power plants. Well, it's still really a steam engine. It's a steam engine running a turbine, and that's pretty old tech. Same thing with the flying car prototypes right now. They're pretty much just a helicopter. So it's innovation using re-engineering old tech, but it's, to me, it's a little disappointing that it's nothing new. And you hear how the government could be hiding, really high technology, that's been, back engineered from alien crash technology or whatever. But then you think about, if you do have a craft that's capable of some sort of hyperspace that, if you're irresponsible, you can like destroy the whole planet just by ramming it into the planet, like in the Star Wars movie where one of the ships crashed into the Imperial cruiser and just blew it apart, so that could be a reason why they don't want to let that technology out. It's just too dangerous for, crazy humans who want to, use technology destructively. So, and another thought, as far as like science fiction being sort of a way to help you think of transhumanist thoughts. When I was a kid, The $6 Million Man was, I think, very influential. And in the opening credits, he's flying in a sort of a space shuttle prototype, and it crashes, and that's how he becomes the $6 Million Man. And also, like in Buck Rogers in the 25th Century, he is flying a space shuttle into deep space, and he becomes cryonically preserved for 500 years and comes back to Earth, and there are sentient robots sort of running things, and the humans are just kind of there as assistants almost, I remember the first episode. I saw it on YouTube the other day. It's the AIs are running the city, and they've programmed themselves for generations. And they live in perfect coexistence with humans. And so yeah, and as far as a question, for me to experience that as a kid, and seeing a lot of the developments of the space shuttle in the kind of middle 80s, that was very influential to me. I thought we were going towards that future, that high tech future, but here we are, and no flying cars yet. Self-driving cars, but still a car. So, yeah, I'm a little disappointed, to tell you the truth. Hopefully things will ramp up in the next couple of decades. Like they're predicting that, going up towards that singularity vertical. But no, actually, I don't have a question. Just random thoughts I need to get out. Now, any thoughts on my random thoughts?
I think, David, you need to unmute.
Yeah, thank you for that. Little frog in my throat today, so occasionally muting. Yeah, I do have some thoughts on your random thoughts. I like that very much. I wrote a note to myself while you were talking. And so the note that I wrote was invisible tech. And what that means to me is that I think the most advanced technology is the technology you can't see. So let me give you some examples. An example that gets used a lot for progress and for mass distribution and affordable to the masses, of course, is the cell phone. We've heard that over and over again. But I think it's also a great example of invisible tech. So what do I mean? We call it a cell phone, and it makes phone calls. Well, I think it does because I hardly ever use it to make phone calls, right? But what else does it do? It takes the place of things from my background. It takes the place of a personal teletypewriter. Okay, it takes the place of a fax machine. It takes the place of a camera. It takes the place of a flashlight. It takes the place of photo albums. It takes the place of file cabinets full of notes or documents that I would have kept for myself. This is one of the things that I think I got this from one of Ray Kurzweil books. Sometimes the sources kind of flow together in my head. No, I do remember where it was from, and it wasn't Kurzweil. It was, it'll come to me here, Pinkerton, Steve Pinker. And he was talking about how things coalesce. And it gave me this idea for invisible tech. So the fact that I can use a computer to talk to you now, face to face, is the kind of tech that excites me. But imagine if we could talk face to face without the need to have some physical device to do that with. That's physical tech. Maybe more relatable would be technology of the clothes that we're wearing. The styles have changed, but a shirt's still a shirt and pants are still pants, but they're not made out of the same things that they were when I was a kid. My shoes are made out of something different. They last much longer. I don't have to iron most of my clothes, which I did when I was a kid. That's invisible tech. There was a company that used to advertise on television, and their slogan went something like this: "It's not the color that we, it's not the color that we make; it's the brightness." Or "It's not the smooth, it's not the fabric; it's the smoothness." And they were talking about all the technology that goes into normal, ordinary things. And I think we can forget those. When we have invisible tech also, when things come into mass acceptance. I'll give you an example. I said here in Phoenix, I see the Waymo driverless cabs, ride shares running around. The very first time I saw one of those, that was a big deal. Now I just see them on the road and pass them or wait for them or whatever else. It's not a big deal anymore. In essence, they become invisible to me. So, Art Ramon, perhaps our flying cars will be invisible tech one of these days.
Well, what I'm sort of seeing as invisible tech in transhumanism is just going to be advanced medical technology. It's going to be technology is going to keep growing and growing and advancing, and everyone is going to be very accepting of this advanced medical technology. So eventually, everyone's going to be a transhumanist, whether they admit to it or not. Otherwise, they'll, be limbless or be sightless. Who will choose to be blind if you have technology to fix it? So, advanced medical technology, I think, will be that invisible technology that everyone would accept in time.
Yes, whether it changes our physical appearance or not, as long as we have the vitality that we want, I completely agree with you, and that will be the case. And we'll actually be able to use status quo bias to our advantage, because then that will be the status quo.
Yes. And the key is, how do we bring about that new status quo? So John H. points out, Rebecca Watson had a podcast where she asserted that while we've made decent progress increasing mean lifespan, we've done effectively nothing about increasing maximum lifespan. And I might quibble with that by a few years, and that the oldest supercentenarians were actually younger by maybe 5 to 10 years in the early 20th century, at least insofar as anyone could verify. And Jeanne Calment set her record in 1997. Nonetheless, there is a problem in this regard. And the problem is that people who survive all of the common ailments of late life, people who don't get major heart disease, cancer, diabetes, dementia, still die of something in their 110s, which most likely is senile systemic amyloidosis, the formation of amyloid plaques throughout the body. And by far, not enough research has been dedicated to this condition, because so many people die of other diseases before reaching that kind of advanced stage, and the sample size of supercentenarians to study is so small, and it's not easy to get to them. The supercentenarian validators have to often undertake a heroic effort to even visit with the supercentenarians and their families and take a few blood samples. That in itself is a bit of a taxing procedure for somebody who is that old. So if some scientific breakthrough could be made to reverse that particular condition, or even slow down its occurrence, it could well be the case that a person would remain biologically old, but could live a few years longer. And that would be the kind of breakthrough in increasing maximum lifespan that would definitely give rise to a change in public perception. So we have about 10 minutes left in our virtual enlightenment salon, and there are hopefully a few other questions, comments, thoughts that I would like to get to. But I would like to ask David for his thoughts about the qualities that he thinks the next U.S. Transhumanist Party Director of Applied Innovation should have. We are going to open the position, and hopefully David himself will be on the interview committee to help us select his successor. But what do you think the attributes of that individual ideally should be to have him continue this illustrious legacy that you have established for the applied innovation position?
Well, thank you for that nice compliment. And yes, I certainly would be happy to help. As I said earlier, though, I don't expect that person to follow in my footsteps. They might have the same title, but I would hope they would make it their own and have it suit the party quite well. Your question was about qualities. And I would see two qualities that sometimes can work against each other. But being the nuanced individual that I am, I'm confident that you can corral those, and that's passion and reason. I think you need a passion for what's new, what's innovative, and innovative, as I discussed earlier, can mean taking two things that are pretty common and putting them together to make something new and to address something new. So having a passion for that is a quality, but having reason behind it too that allows you to maybe take a look at this from a business implementation standpoint or a public acceptance standpoint is also necessary. Reason also to look at the positives and the negatives or the benefits and the threats goes along with reason, but passion is what drives that forward and keeps you from stopping when you see threats and looking for ways to go beyond that. Other qualities, I think they would need even more than I did for the way that I presented this. I would hope to see that more involvement with the public in things that are tangible, not talking, trying to expose as I did, because I thought that was appropriate for the time. But I like this idea of projects, maybe with other organizations or other people, to show them how transhumanist ideas and innovations work together and can be beneficial. There's nothing quite like showing somebody something versus talking about it to really make a difference. So I think those would be some of the qualities. Obviously, there would be some other things that would be a basis for this too, and I'm not even sure they need to be discussed, but the person would need to have a transhumanist viewpoint. And I think that means fully embracing the aspects of what transhumanism are, and then channeling those that are most productive for talking about innovation and making it personal. I think the future is personal in everything we do, whether it's personal medicine, personal education, and whatever it might be. I think innovation has to be personal too, because the spectrum is going to be so large. One size clearly will not fit all. It never did, in my opinion, but even more so as we move into the future. So that needs to be a quality that needs to be there as well. Any other thoughts from any of the other panelists? I'm interested to hear what they might think.
Yes, thank you very much, David. And I will open this up to the other panelists. First, I want to point out that we have a Facebook page for Applied Innovation that you kindly set up for us and you have been maintaining for the past 3 years. I invite everyone to visit it. And this page has now been branded to potentially apply to anyone who occupies the applied innovation position in the future. David has been making posts on it regularly, even to this time through the end of September at the very least. But the next director of applied innovation is definitely going to have as one of his or her tasks the maintenance of this page. So any applicant should think about what they would want to put on it. But I very much like your comment about practical applications and demonstrations of emerging technologies and how we could integrate those into our day-to-day endeavors. And given that we have fewer than 5 minutes remaining, I would invite other comments from the panel and from the audience about what qualities the next director of applied innovation should have. Perhaps, Daniel, you might have some thoughts on this.
Well, Elon Musk has that saying, the best part is no part, when he's building something. And it gives me the impression that, we spend 8 hours of our day going quietly insane at night when we sleep. But there are people who can lucid dream and have godlike powers in their dreams, So what if we leveraged the power of lucid dreaming to do applied innovation? I think that would be a fun experiment. There's little devices that I think detect when you're in deep REM, and they blink a little light. And if you see the light, you can realize you're dreaming, and then you can go on and travel through the universe like a god, with godlike powers. So that's an example of the best part being no part. Maybe we could explore. But yeah, I think learning to think differently, having the right to repair civilization. Maybe we need to have more of the applied part, necessity being the mother of invention. And, we're not going to live very long as an individual if the surrounding environment doesn't live long. So those would be some of my thoughts on the applied innovation topic. Thanks again.
Yes, thank you to Daniel. And our friend Spectral Valkyrie writes, Cognitech with lucid dreaming, right on. I would be interested to speak with somebody who can effectively and methodically engage in lucid dreaming, because that could be a space for creative experimentation, provided that the outcomes can be remembered and translated into the waking world. Jason Geringer writes, first principles thinking and creative out-of-the-box thinking would be important attributes for the next occupant of the Director of Applied Innovation position. I would invite anybody who is interested to contact us. Go to the Transhumanist Party website, and you can see some contact information there, and send in your application. In the meantime, we have 2 minutes left in this salon. So, David, I would invite you to offer some closing thoughts for us today.
Well, thanks so much for this opportunity to talk about applied innovation and to talk about transhumanist principles in general as it applied. So today what I attempted to do is talk a little bit about what I brought and why to the Office of Director of Applied Innovation, and to try to stress the idea that the next Director of Applied Innovation should bring their own unique background, interest, passion, and reasoning to the topic, and not feel like that they have to fit some particular type of mold. That's not what the Transhumanist Party is about anyway, and I just want to further emphasize that. Perhaps some of the things that they might want to look into as they move forward were some of the things we've already talked about today, but not forget about some of the things that we hadn't talked about. Augmented reality, virtual reality, the metaverse is still coming, and that's going to be very transhumanist. I think it's going to follow a similar path the way PC acceptance did. Right now, AR and VR is silently at work in the commercial aspects of America, where it's being used in plants and being used in repair situations and so forth. Remember, computers were first accepted in science and then into the business world before they ever became fully accepted as far as individual devices in homes and so forth. So I think we'll see that. We'll see it in other areas that will benefit people. I posted about this on the Applied Innovation page. It's something called an Apollo. It's a type of technology that you can use that takes old school tapping techniques and turns them into something high tech that's measurable and useful. And I promised an updated review, which I'm going to have to write for it. But those type of technologies, personal electronics has changed a lot from CD players and Walkman, okay? So there's a lot of things that we can do with it these days that are very transhumanist. We talked a little bit on communications. We talked about the ease of that. And not just transferring information, but also the human aspect of it. One of the reasons I was on that call to New Zealand is Rugby World Cup is going on right now. And the New Zealand team had a very exciting, nail-biting, if you will, rugby game with Ireland yesterday. So we're talking to people yesterday just in New Zealand, but in the past we've had group conversations where we had New Zealand, we had South Africa, we had England on board, and we even had one family member that was traveling in China at the time. This is commonplace today, and that's only going to move forward, and it can be very beneficial to people. And then we're back to electric vehicles, including air vehicles. The U.S. Air Force is buying electric air vehicles right now. Okay?
Yes.
So there's much going on out there. It's going to be an exciting position for somebody to fill.
Absolutely. It will be quite exciting. We encourage applications, and thank you so much, David, for sharing your insights with you today. We hope that all of our viewers and our officers will live long and prosper.